Good afternoon and welcome to Oklahoma City University via webinar. My name is Martha Berger and I'm the president of OCU. Welcome to the third lecture of our 2021 Neustadt lecture series with Dr. Alvin Rosenfeld. I want to give special thanks to the Neustadt family for their gift of endowed lectureship to the Wimberley School of Religion. Walter and Dolores Neustadt of Ardmore, Oklahoma, established this lecture series in 1983 to help us strengthen our understanding of the great contributions of the Judaic religious tradition to Western civilization and thought. Scholars are invited to campus to speak on informative themes in the area of Hebrew scripture, Judaic thought, and Jewish ethics and art. Thank you again for attending, and now I'll turn it over to Dr. Lisa Wolf.
Thank you, President Berger. I'm Dr. Lisa Wolf, professor of Hebrew Bible here at the Wimberley School of Religion at Oklahoma City University. As a United Methodist University, we have both a longstanding commitment to interfaith work and a weekly chapel service. So it has been our tradition that when the Neustadt lecture falls during the chapel hour, we begin with a brief time for psalms and music. I now invite Reverend Elizabeth Horton-Ware, who is our Director of Religious Life, to open with a psalm. And after the music, we will hear from Rabbi Vered Harris of Temple B'nai Israel here in Oklahoma City.
I will open today with Psalm 134 from the Jewish Publication Society version. Now bless the Lord, all you servants of the Lord, who stand nightly in the house of the Lord. Lift your hands towards the sanctuary and bless the Lord. May the Lord, maker of heaven and earth, bless you from Zion.
Now I invite you to a time of reflective listening while we see and hear the Oklahoma City University singers in the Angie B. Smith Chapel Sanctuary, conducted by Associate Director of Choral Activities, Tony Gonzalez. The music we will hear is composed by Kim Andre Arneson, who writes that the text was written by a Jew hiding in Cologne, Germany during World War II. The text was found scratched onto a wall. You'll see the text at the bottom of your screen during the music. The piece is entitled, Even When He is Silent.
From Psalm 133, Shir Hamalot LeDavid, Hine Matov Manayim Shevet Achim Gam Yachad, a song of ascents of David. How good and pleasant it is when brothers and sisters dwell together. Kashemen Hatov al Harosh Yored al Hazakan Zakan Aharon, Sheyored al Pi Midotav. It's like fine oil on the head running down onto the beard of Aaron that comes down over the collar of his robe. Ketal Hermon sheyored al hararei Tzion, Kisham tziva Adonai et habracha, Chayim ad ha'olam. Like the dew of Hermon that falls upon the mountains of Zion. How good it is, how pleasant it is. There the Eternal One ordained the blessing, everlasting life.
Thank you, Rabbi Harris, and thank you, Reverend Horton Ware. I'm now pleased to introduce Dr. Alvin Rosenfeld for our third and final Neustadt lecture of 2021. Dr. Alvin H. Rosenfeld is professor of English and Jewish Studies at Indiana University, Bloomington, and has taught at Indiana University since 1968. He holds the Irving M. Glazer Chair in Jewish Studies and is director of the university's Institute for the Study of Contemporary Antisemitism. He founded Indiana University's well-regarded Bourne's Jewish Studies program and served as its director for 30 years. Professor Rosenfeld has served as an editorial board member of various scholarly journals, including Holocaust and Genocide Studies and Anti-Semitism Studies, as well as a board member and scholarly consultant to various Jewish institutions and organizations, including the Anti-Defamation League, the American Jewish Committee, and the Lilly Endowment, among others. Some of his publications include the 2019 collection Anti-Zionism and Anti-Semitism, The Dynamics of Delegitimization, and Deciphering the New Anti-Semitism from 2015. He is also editor of a series of books on Jewish literature and culture published by Indiana University Press, as well as being editor of IUP's book series, Studies in Anti-Semitism. Coming in November of this year will be his edited collection entitled Contending with Anti-Semitism in a Rapidly Changing Political Climate. For these and all of Dr. Rosenfeld's other titles with Indiana University Press, the publishing house has extended a generous offer of 30% off to all webinar participants. You just need to use the discount code Rosenfeld, and I will place that in the chat for you later on during the lecture. Dr. Rosenfeld has been honored with Indiana University's Distinguished Service Award, Provost's Medal, and President's Medal, which is Indiana University's highest award in recognition of scholarly accomplishment, service, and leadership. Welcome, Dr. Rosenfeld. We are pleased to have you with us.
Thank you, Dr. Wolf, and thank you, President Berger. I've given many lectures, but I don't know when any of my lectures have been preceded by such really beautiful music. And what a special treat it was to hear Rabbi Harris's lovely Hebrew. So thanks for all of that. And thanks to the miracle of Zoom, it's almost as if Bloomington, Indiana, where I am now, and Oklahoma City have become suburbs of one another. I've been with you Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday. What in the world am I going to do tomorrow? I'll find something else to do, but it's really been a very great pleasure and honor to be your Neustadt lecturer this year. Now to my topic. Hostility to Jews and Judaism, as I've pointed out in my previous lectures, dates back over many centuries, has a variety of causes, and manifests itself in various ways. Here is how the late Rabbi Lord Jonathan Sacks summed up this troubled history, and I quote Rabbi Sacks: "Not liking Jews is not anti-Semitism. We all have people we don't like. Anti-Semitism means denying the right of Jews to exist collectively as Jews with the same rights as everyone else. It takes different forms in different ages. In the Middle Ages, Jews were hated because of their religion. In the 19th and early 20th century, they were hated because of their race. Today, they are hated because of their nation state, the state of Israel." All of that quoted from Rabbi Sacks. Hatred of Israel, often referred to as anti-Zionism, will be at the center of my remarks to you today, especially as it closely allies with anti-Semitism. Here is one memorable example of the threats posed by the links between hatred of Israel and Jew hatred. 1 year after Osama bin Laden ordered the deadly terrorist attacks on New York and Washington, D.C. on 9/11/2001, he, the leader of Al-Qaeda, issued what he called a letter to the American public. In his message, bin Laden denounced America as what he called the worst civilization in the history of mankind, and he singled out the Jews as the source of America's wickedness. I quote him: "Your law is the law of the rich and wealthy people. Behind them stand the Jews, who control your policies, media, and your economy." He went on to excoriate America for its support of Israel, whose creation he declared, and I quote him again, "is a crime which must be erased. If America continues to back Israel," he warned, "this will result in more disasters for you. Do not await anything from us but jihad." All of that quoted. Under the guise of an anti-Zionism intimately tied to anti-Semitism, hostility to both Jews and the Jewish state is not restricted to the aggressive words and deeds of jihadis, but is today, unfortunately, widespread. Recognizing these links, Stephen Harper, the former Canadian Prime Minister, calls anti-Zionism, and I quote him, "the face of the new anti-Semitism." It targets the Jewish people by targeting Israel, and it attempts to make the old bigotry acceptable for a new generation. Pope Francis has been equally emphatic, proclaiming, and I quote the Pope's words, that to attack Jews is anti-Semitism, but an outright attack on the state of Israel is also anti-Semitism. The British writer Alan Johnson agrees, noting, and I quote him, that what the demonized and essentialized Jew once was, demonized and essentialized Israel now is, considered malevolent in its very nature, all-controlling, full of bloodlust, and the obstacle to a better world. Those who see Israel in these negative terms regularly denounce the country as an evil entity or criminal state, and they accuse it of the worst of sins, namely racism, apartheid, crimes against humanity, ethnic cleansing, and even genocide. The effect of such denunciations is to demonize and delegitimize the Jewish state and to call into question its very right to exist, a right denied to no other state on the globe. Understood in these terms, Rabbi Sachs is right to conclude, and I quote him one last time, that anti-Zionism is the anti-Semitism of our time. Proponents of anti-Semitism disagree. They reject any ties to anti-Semitism, and they contend that Israel should not be immune to criticism. On this latter point, they are right. No state should be immune to criticism, including Israel. Within Israel itself, a democratic country with a free press, criticism of all kinds is a daily and robust affair. But there are crucial differences between what we typically think of as legitimate criticism and mean-spirited vilification. The first is based on rational arguments against the country's policies and typically aims to use criticism to bring about reforms. The second is driven by hostile passions, and at its most extreme, it questions a country's right to be. Informed, well-intentioned criticism of Israeli policies and actions, in fact, is welcome because it can be constructive. But what anti-Zionists call for is the opposite. Not an improved Israel, but no Israel at all. They pursue their destructive aims by seeking to provoke feelings of contempt, hatred, disgust, and abhorrence directed at the Jewish state. If these feelings take hold in enough people over time, so this line of thinking goes, they might be mobilized to support the annihilationist goal of ridding the world of Israel. What is involved in the debates between Zionists and anti-Zionists, therefore, are not merely semantic differences, but highly charged political and ideological disputes of an irreconcilable kind. Simply put, Zionism affirms the Jewish people's right to national self-determination in an independent and sovereign state. Such a state has existed since 1948, and its legitimacy has long been recognized by the United Nations and most of the world's other states. Anti-Zionism denies that right, and it seeks to delegitimize Jewish nationhood and eliminate the state that has been its political and territorial expression for more than 7 decades. Inasmuch as almost 50% of the world's Jewish population today resides in Israel, that's to say almost 1 out of every 2 Jews alive is resident in Israel, and also because the great majority of Jews living elsewhere in the world identify closely with Israel. The loss of the state would be nothing short of catastrophic for the Jewish people as a whole. Such a prospect, coming 2 generations after the European destruction of most of European Jewry, would be the culmination of anti-Semitism in one of its most destructive forms ever. No doubt it was in recognition of such a nightmarish scenario that in 2016, the 31 member states of the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, or IHRA, adopted what they called the working definition of anti-Semitism. The United States State Department has also officially adopted this definition and encourages other governments and institutions to do so as well, and many more have done so. While the IHRA definition explicitly states, and I quote, that criticism of Israel, similar to that leveled against any other country, cannot be regarded as anti-Semitic. I want to repeat that because that's going to be important for something that's going to follow shortly. Criticism of Israel, similar to that leveled against any other country, cannot be regarded as anti-Semitic. It nonetheless goes on to include several examples of alleged criticism of Israel and the Jews that are deemed to be anti-Semitic, and they include the following: accusing the Jews as a people or Israel as a state of inventing or exaggerating the Holocaust. For good reason, that's considered anti-Semitic. 2, accusing Jewish citizens living elsewhere of being more loyal to Israel than to the interests of the nations where they reside. 3, denying the Jewish people their right to self-determination by claiming that the existence of the state of Israel is by its nature a racist endeavor. 4, applying double standards by requiring of Israel a behavior not expected or demanded of any other democratic nation. 5, using the symbols and images associated with classic anti-Semitism, such as the claims of Jews killing Jesus or of blood libel, to characterize Israel or Israelis, and some other things that I won't take time up with citing. Those who actively oppose Israel's existence and labor to see the country eradicated object to this very IHRA definition of anti-Semitism that I just mentioned to you on the grounds that it supposedly silences criticism of Israel and thereby limits free speech. As I already noted to you, though, the definition itself makes clear that criticism of Israel, like that leveled against any other country, cannot and should not be regarded as anti-Semitic. The examples that I just cited to you, however, fall outside the boundaries of what we think of as normative criticism. Comparing Israel to Nazi Germany, for instance, is not to criticize the country, but to defame it and libel it. And calling for the country's end is nothing short of eliminationist in its goals. There are countries, Iran is one, that remain fervent in their opposition to the Jewish state, and they pledge to destroy it. 20 years ago, for instance, the then president of Iran, Hashemi Rafsanjani, boasted, and these are his words, that the use of even one nuclear bomb inside Israel will destroy everything. Some of Rafsanjani's successors have made similar threats. As recently as last year, the chief of Iran's armed forces threatened to obliterate Israeli cities within 20 to 30 minutes. This year, the country's supreme leader, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, proudly displayed a poster invoking the language of Nazi Germany's final solution to predict the coming end of Israel. Words matter, as we know, and the expression of militantly aggressive sentiments of the kind I've just put before you should not be dismissed as merely rhetorical, particularly coming from the leadership of a country actively engaged in building the components of what could be nuclear weapons. Elsewhere, the language may not be so extreme, but even in our own country, there are individuals on the political left and the political right, as well as within some Islamic organizations, who also remain committed actively to Israel's ends. Some proponents of the BDS movement, for example, are explicit about this goal. They may claim that BDS is committed to merely boycotting Israel, but at the top of the movement, there are those who have far more ambitious goals in mind. One of its more prominent advocates, Asad Abu Khalil, for instance, writes, and I quote him, "The real aim of BDS is to bring down the state of Israel. That should be stated," he continues, "as an unambiguous goal. There should not be any equivocation on the subject. Justice and freedom for the Palestinians are incompatible with the existence of the state of Israel." Omar Barghouti, a co-founder of BDS, agrees. He's on record favoring what he calls, and I quote him, the euthanasia for Israel. And just this week, a few days ago, speaking at a forum organized by the Democratic Socialists of America, Mark Lamont Hill, a professor at Temple University in Philadelphia and a prominent activist in the Black Lives Matter movement, declared, and I quote his words, "Black Lives Matter is for the dismantling of the Zionist project and very explicitly embraces BDS on those grounds," all of that quoted. He and other supporters of BDS believe that Israel never should have been created in the first place, and they're doing what they can to bring about its demise. They regard the very existence of a Jewish majority state as an intolerable provocation, and they want to see it gone. Passionately embraced attitudes of hostility, such as anti-Zionism, have a history worth recalling. Dating back over decades, anti-Zionism accelerated energetically following the Six-Day War in June 1967, when Israel, threatened with destruction, successfully fought off a determined onslaught by surrounding Arab states. What Israel achieved militarily, however, was denied it politically, especially when the Soviet Union and its Arab allies intensified their opposition to the Jewish state through major and continuing propaganda efforts. These culminated on November the 10th, 1975, when the United Nations General Assembly voted for Resolution 3379 that denounced Zionism as a form of racism and racial discrimination. Virtually all Western countries, including the United States, voted against this toxic resolution, which Daniel Patrick Moynihan, America's ambassador to the UN at the time, denounced in the strongest of terms, and I quote Moynihan, "A great evil has been loosed upon the world. The abomination of anti-Semitism has been now given the appearance of international sanction," end quote. The resolution was revoked in 1971, 16 years after its passage, but the damage was done. To countless numbers of people throughout the world, Israel branded a racist state and subsequently a fascist, apartheid, Nazi state, is scorned, derided, and denounced as an illegitimate and pariah entity, an outcast among the nations of the world. Once hostile notions of this kind penetrate mainstream consciousness, they are not easy to dislodge. And yet nothing says that they must remain in place forever. As more people come to recognize the baselessness of the vicious charges against Israel and see how the threats made against the Jewish state contribute ominously to a resurgent anti-Semitism, hateful attitudes may begin to diminish. Such, at least, is the hope. Are there grounds for such hope? In fact, I think there are. As an example, Saudi Arabia, the wealthiest and the most influential of the Sunni Arab states, has for some years carried on substantial, if clandestine, ties to Israel. Saudi leadership is becoming more open these days about their ties to Israel, and the country's media are beginning to feature positive stories about the Jewish state and about Jews. In addition, and for the first time, Saudi Arabia has begun to remove some of the anti-Semitic and anti-Zionist content that has long been a staple in its country's school books. In a recent development, some Arab states have also begun to distance themselves from their decades-long animosity toward Israel and are openly normalizing relations with the country. We know, for instance, thanks to the Abraham Accords, that they include the United Arab Emirates, Bahrain, Sudan, and Morocco, and others may follow. Already, two-way visits between Israelis and people from some of these Arab countries are taking place in an open and, in fact, friendly way. Despite the restrictions of the present COVID-19 pandemic, some 130,000 Israelis have visited the UAE within the last few months, and at least 4 Emirati groups have been to Israel. The fact that food markets in Dubai now feature Israeli products and display Israeli flags, and that hotels in the UAE now advertise that they feature kosher meals for observant Jews who may wish to visit, are signs that normalization is progressing and that still better days may lie ahead. As in all human relationships, normalcy, decency, and honest face-to-face encounters nourish hope. And where there is hope, there is life. The words that I just put before you, where there is hope, there is life, are quoted. And they're quoted from a book that most of you, I suspect, have read. Its author was Anne Frank, a bright, gifted, high-spirited girl who never made it to the age of 16. Why? Simply put, the virulent hatreds against Jews prevalent in Anne Frank's day doomed her to a cruel and early end. Today, her corpse lies in a mass grave in the Bergen-Belsen concentration camp with tens of thousands of others, all of them murdered for what was then seen as the sin of being born Jewish. The real sin, of course, lies elsewhere, with the popular annihilationist anti-Semitism that brought on the death of millions of people as innocent as Anne Frank. At its most fervent, today's anti-Zionism is similarly annihilationist and threatens to be equally destructive. We must all do whatever we can to see that it not succeed. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Rosenfeld. We are so grateful for all you have taught us this week. And I'd like to move for the remainder of our hour to Rabbi Vered Harris of Temple B'nai Israel and Rabbi Abby Jacobson of Emmanuel Synagogue, both here in Oklahoma City, to bring some questions and discussion with Dr. Rosenfeld. I'm afraid we may not have time for many more questions, though you are welcome to pose them in the Q&A, and if we have time to get to them, we will do so. Why don't I invite Rabbi Jacobson to begin?
Thank you. So thank you, Dr. Rosenfeld. I wonder if you could comment a little bit more about the things you said at the end, about some of the hopeful nature of newly established relations between Israel and some of the other countries. Do you think that this is brought on by a warming of relations in the area? Do you think that this is cold hard cash winning out over cold peace? Do you see any sort of a trend that we might be able to bottle and get here, as we've seen anti-Semitism in the US on the rise?
To the first two of your points, yes, by all means. What drives those relations are the very things you mentioned. I think the Arab states, now I'm quite convinced there will be additional ones, by the way, see the good of having ties to Israel, those ties being political, commercial, cultural, and also security ties. The most hopeful aspect of what I'm seeing is that they're people-to-people ties. So as we know, Israel has enjoyed a paper peace, which is better than no peace at all, with Egypt and Jordan, but it's not been a people-to-people peace, mostly because rulers in Egypt and Jordan haven't wanted to bring the peoples together. That's not the case with the countries who've recently joined the Abraham Accord. So all of that is good. It's a very different situation, though, in this country. Would I like to see ways to dampen down Israel hatred in this country? Sure. Do I think it'll be possible over time? Yes. But we have a lot of work to do. And hopefully the talk I presented to you today and what others are doing may be an indication that it's possible to do such work. So Am I pessimistic about the future? No, but it's not going to be a breeze, and we have to take things serious. We have to take serious things seriously and work as hard and as effectively as we can to improve matters.
Thank you so much for being here again with us and for that answer to Rabbi Jacobson's question. I'm wondering, just as the other day we talked about kind of from the right and from the left, I'm wondering a little bit about another domestic perspective in terms of Israel, and something that sometimes we see in Oklahoma, where pro-Zionism or pro-Israel, and I'm not sure exactly which, seems to almost flirt with anti-Judaism or anti-Semitism. So in other words, the desire for there to be a strong Israel is laced with the underlying hope that that will lead to the end of days, and if all Jews would just, and kind of that perspective. Do you have any thoughts on that flirting, that kind of pro-Israel, anti-Jewish experience?
Rabbi Harris, if I understand what you're asking me, and I think I do, but I don't meet up with it, I have to say, whereas in Oklahoma you may meet up with it. It strikes me that it's part of an apocalyptic strain with certain kinds of Christian belief that sees the return of Jesus or the coming of heaven itself contingent on what's going to happen in the Middle East. And what's going to happen is either some ferocious war of Gog and Magog, as it's referred to, or the Jews will finally come around to realizing the truths of the gospel and embrace them. To be honest, I've never had a one-on-one conversation with a person who holds to these beliefs. Would I? Sure. Would I be able to convince such a person that maybe this is not the right way to go, that there might be better ways to think about Israel, Jews, Judaism, Jewish-Christian relations? I would do my best. But you're the one living in Oklahoma and not I. So, b'hatzlacha, I wish you good luck in all of your important work. And I look forward to staying in touch with you beyond this series.
I love that answer. Thank you. And thank you, Rabbi Harris, for asking that question. It's certainly on my mind in my work as well. Dr. Rosenfeld, I wonder, I know, as a Jewish person, I know that there are two answers to the question of what is appropriate criticism of Israel versus what is anti-Semitism.
Mm-hmm.
I know that that requires an answer for the Jewish community and an answer for the non-Jewish community. We are so lucky in Oklahoma to have a very strong interfaith community that asks the question of, at the same time, am I offending you in this way? I'm going out of my way to try not to offend. And also, am I promoting rights and causes well enough? And so I certainly hear questions from both the Jewish community and the non-Jewish community about, what is appropriate language and what are some more detailed parameters. How does a person speak for Palestinian rights without discounting the right of Israel to exist? How does a person advocate for thoughtful critique of Israel without causing anti-Semitism as a result? And again, if you wouldn't mind contextualizing that as an answer for non-Jewish community and an answer for the Jewish community as well.
Well, well-informed constructive criticism is always welcome. There's no doubt about it. And Israel, like all countries, is not and should not be immune to criticism, not all of its leaders and not all of its policies. are perfect with a capital P. Israel has its problems, and pointing those out, especially if the aim is to help improve the situation, is all for the good. If the aim, however, is demonization, dehumanization, delegitimization, etc., then we've crossed the line into something that's not criticism, but vilification, defamation, libel. So I would really have to hear a particular example, I suppose, in order to answer more concretely. What I can say about Palestinian rights is that Palestinians, like all other people, certainly should enjoy good rights. I'm personally convinced, as are many in Israel, that the possibility of a two-state solution, a safe and secure Israel living side by side with a safe and secure Palestine, could be possible. A Palestinian state could be created next month, I'm convinced, if the Palestinians would at long last recognize the legitimacy of Israel as a Jewish majority state, call off any claims against it, and enter into a peace agreement. They've been given those opportunities with the Peel Commission in 38. In 47 and 48, there could have been the creation of two states, one Jewish majority, one Arab, as we know. They were offered such a state in 2000, 2001, 2008, under Ehud Barak and Olmert as well. Each time they've turned it down. So you have to ask yourself, why is there not a Palestinian state when time after time they've been offered such a state? And I think the answer is they've not been willing to recognize the legitimacy of Israel as a Jewish majority state. They've tried to eliminate it, and they've not succeeded, and they won't succeed. So that's the best answer I can give.
Well, it looks like we have time for a couple questions from our Q&A, and one of them that I'd like to offer to you is about how those of us in academia can deal with anti-Zionist anti-Semitism in academic institutions.
Yeah, those things have no place in an academic institution or in civil society at all. There are groups. Tammy Rossman Benjamin's Amcha on the West Coast is one of them that's especially effective at calling attention to anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism as they manifest themselves on campuses. She and others elsewhere, the Brandeis Center, not Brandeis University, but the Brandeis Center in Washington, D.C., similarly, and the American Jewish Committee and the ADL and Stand With Us and various other organizations, AEN, the Academic Engagement Network, all of these are actively involved in trying to dampen down hostility directed against Jewish students, which often comes from very rabid, very aggressive anti-Israel activities on campuses, the BDS movement being one, Israel Apartheid Week, which exists on a number of campuses, still another one. So I think what needs to be done is an expose of the total irregularity and harm that such activities cause when they take place on campuses. America has something like 3,000 colleges and universities. Most of them don't see these problems, at least in a chronic, ongoing way, but there may well be 100 or 150 campuses, especially on the West Coast and the East Coast, including some of our best academic institutions, where such a very aggressive, nasty anti-Israel and anti-Semitic presence is making itself felt, And that's a serious development.
Thank you. And a somewhat related question to shift to faith communities. As I mentioned to you before you came, we have a vibrant interfaith community here in Oklahoma City and a number of faith leaders who are at the webinar today. One who asked, what can leaders of various faith communities, Christian and otherwise, do to help lead people toward acceptance of both Jewish people and Israel?
Yeah, talk. I don't want to say argue. Better to say talk. Get to know one another. Most of all, learn, because oddly enough, we live in a world of slogans. And when people think in slogans, they stop thinking. It's important to read some things, to know what's what. I just mentioned the Peel Commission. I mentioned 48, 2000, 2001, 2008, so on and so forth. I think people, at least who take a public position as an advocate or opponent, need to do their homework and know what they're talking about. And what surprises me, and I'd say in many times, it's off-putting to meet with people with very strong opinions and very little knowledge. So the more one can know, the better. But I'm totally for Jews and Christians meeting as Jews and Christians, speaking amicably, candidly. We're still in the pandemic, so we're wearing masks and social distancing. Get together for some chicken soup and matzo balls and generally live a good life with one another. That's why we're here. At the end of one of my lectures recently, I quote, although I didn't mention I was quoting from the end of Deuteronomy, but Dr. Wolf, you're a Hebrew Bible scholar, so when I said we're summoned to choose life, I meant it. We are summoned to choose life. God, we're told, has put before us blessings and curses, life and death. Therefore, let me hear you. No, I won't put you on the spot to quote it, but I'm sure you could in your sleep, as could the two rabbis and many of the others here. Therefore, we're told, choose life. So if I could end these three lectures, which I realize are not cheerful lectures, with heavy subject matter, on any note at all, it's the one I live with myself and affirm and keeps me going. We need reasons to get out of bed in the morning. And the best reason is we are blessed with the gift of life, and we should always come down on the side of life and be against people who oppose that. And I'll leave it there. Continue to choose life, live a good life with people, including different people, and let's have a better tomorrow. Thank you so much for having me as your Neustadt lecturer. I have to go and teach a class right now on the Holocaust. So anyway, I'm teaching Primo Levi today, a favorite author, and let me say, if not a total and farewell, thank you for having me. It's been a great honor, a great privilege, and a great pleasure. When I wake up tomorrow morning, I won't know how to connect. Well, I will know how to connect with Oklahoma City through you, Lisa Wolf. So thank you all for coming to these lectures. Bye.
And let me thank you. And a regret about Zoom is that we can't hear the large round of applause that I'm sure we would if we were in person. So we're so grateful to you for being with us this week. My regrets to those who sent in great questions that we didn't have time to get to. A reminder that anyone who registered for the webinar will receive a follow-up email with a link to the recordings. And a last word of thanks to Sky Toland for technical support today, and to Sarah Kelly for managing the RSVPs. But again, thank you so much, Dr. Rosenfeld, for being with us. And thank you all for joining us.
My pleasure. And best to everybody.